Hello everybody, my name is John Mark Johnson Jr. I am the host of Reformed GGA, and today I wanted to talk to you guys about a semi-recent addition to my gun collection. This is a CZ Bren 2 in 7.62x39, and I am of the opinion that this is probably the most advanced 7.62x39 gun that is available on the American commercial market, and I kind of suspect that it's going to be that way for quite some time. This is probably going to be the top contender for 7.62x39 guns for more or less than the foreseeable future. Before I get into details on justifying that, however, I did want to kind of, by way of comparison, reintroduce an old channel favorite that I've had for quite a long time as well, and that is the KS-47 from Palmetto State Armory. Those of you guys who have watched the channel know that I have a rather interesting relationship with PSA. I like the fact that a lot of their guns are relatively inexpensive and also relatively innovative. My problem with them is generally their quality control. It rather sucks, and there's been very few guns, like practically none, that I've gotten from them that didn't have some issue in some way, shape, or form. And the KS-47, this is a pistol version with a 10.5-inch barrel. This one was no exception. In order to get this thing to run correctly, there were some changes that needed to be made. Some of them were by PSA. They wound up making different versions of the gun over time to correct some of those issues, and then some of the issues were things that I dealt with on my side. As far as things that were done on their side, the first generation of the KS-47 had issues with magazine tilts. They use AK magazines, which are rock and lock, and in the original version they didn't have over insertion tabs like they do in this particular version. This is the Gen 2, so it has the over insertion tabs. The originals didn't, and so the magazine was a little bit wobbly, and it was wobbly enough that it would actually interfere with the bolt carrier group and cause cycling and feeding issues and that sort of thing, and of course that was definitely less than ideal. So the overall gun itself, especially in terms of the receivers, needed to be updated. And then another issue that I found that I personally had to deal with that they didn't fix was that a lot of these guns are horribly overgassed, and so a relatively simple solution to having an overgassed AR, rather, if you're not in a position to actually fix the gas system itself by putting in some kind of an adjustable system or something like that, a little bit lower cost and certainly a lot easier fix is simply to put in a heavier weight buffer, which is what I chose to do. So this one has an H3 buffer in it now to mitigate the overgassed nature of it. And then on top of that, there was still, even though it was a Gen 2 version that I eventually wound up buying because it had the over insertion tabs in it, even at that it still didn't function quite right. Even if after I put in the heavier buffer to compensate for the over gassing, it would still go through extractors like nobody's business. And I found out that that is not only because the original extractors were frankly not the best for this kind of gun, but the original bolt carrier group as a whole also wasn't particularly good either. And PSA actually wound up making a whole new version of the bolt carrier group, and so that is what this one has in it now. I don't know if you guys can read that there, but on the forward part of the bolt carrier group, this one says TCE. The version of the bolt carrier group that this originally came with, that this gun originally came with, said hybrid in that spot, meaning that it was a hybrid system meant to work in an AR but with AK magazines. That's what they meant by hybrid. Now they put TCE on there to say that this is the version that is made specifically for the Toolcraft extractors. But the extractors by themselves wasn't enough to fix the problem. You had to actually get a new bolt carrier group for those new extractors to actually work, which this one finally has, and now it's reasonably reliable and even reasonably modernized. But it still has some limitations. One of them is the fact that it uses AK magazines. And that makes some sense in the sense that the most common 7.62x39 magazine that is on the market that actually works reasonably well is, of course, the AK magazine. And what helps it work so well is the fact that it is a double-stack, double-feed magazine with a constant curvature. So it's not having to bend through different shapes or anything, but the natural stacking of the rounds is what this thing uses, and that is a very reliable feed system. Not even talking about 7.62x39, but in general, those kinds of magazines, double stack, double feed, with a constant curvature throughout the entire magazine, have historically been associated with very reliable systems. To take it even completely out of the realm of rifle cartridges, we could take a look at, say, 9mm and look at really good magazines in 9mm. A couple of premier examples of that would be things like the CZ Scorpion magazine, that again is a double stack, double feed magazine with a constant curvature. We could also look at the updated MP5 magazines. Originally they had some straight magazines that weren't all that great, but once they went to double stack, double feed magazines with a constant curvature in the MP5s, they ran a whole lot better. There were also some issues with adapting them to ammo that was available on the American market and things like that. But the double stack, double feed, constant curvature magazines greatly helped with that. Just pretty much everywhere that you look in the firearms world, double stack, double feed, constant curvature magazines have been a big part of making guns reliable. And in 7.62x39, the only magazine that is commonly available that is like that is the AK magazine. So if you want it to be relatively reliable in terms of cycling, whatever gun you're making, whatever gun you're adapting, you want to use the 7.62x39 magazines that come out of AKs, because they are the ones that, for the longest time, have been the best at getting that job done. And if you try to use another magazine system, well, either you have to come up with something that's proprietary, which a lot of people don't want, or you're going to have to come up with something that is going to have to change shape. For example, there are ARs out there that are not made to take AK magazines, but still fire 7.62x39, and those ones use a modified AR magazine. So you're still using the non-proprietary AR system to an extent, but the magazine itself is very bizarre. It has a very straight magazine well so that it can work in a typical AR with a typical lower, but the bottom of the magazine is highly curved, and what they're trying to do is basically average out the curvature of the AK magazine. So they make the top straight so it fits in a normal AR lower, and then the bottom of it is super curved to compensate for the fact that it's not curved the whole way, and those tend to have some reliability issues. Not that they can't be reliable, or that no company or no person has ever put one together that's reliable. No, people have, but it's just more difficult. And so that's one of the first problems, is that if you use a straight push type magazine that is more common in the West, then you can run into reliability issues. If you don't want to run into the reliability issues, yes, you can design your gun around the AK magazine, and that takes care of the reliability issue, but it's not going to be as ergonomically superior as other Western guns. In the case of the KS-47, it's decently reliable, and a lot of that comes to the fact that it takes AK magazines. Great, fine, wonderful, but since it's an AK magazine, it's not exactly drop-free. I can go ahead and push the release and shake it, and it's not going to drop out. I have to manually insert it, and I have to manually remove it every single time, and it's not the quickest magazine to work with. That is just a fundamental problem that pretty much every Western gun is going to have to deal with. Either we have to modify an existing magazine to take 7.62x39, and there's reliability issues when you do that, or we use the magazine that's reliable, but that makes the gun ergonomically inferior in another way, and that rock and locks are not drop free, and they're not quite as quick and easy to use as the normal push type magazines that you would see in like an AR or most other modern Western systems. So one of the issues is the magazine on 7.62x39 Western guns is usually inferior in one way or another. Either it winds up being a rock and lock, which is not very fast to change, or it's something that is faster to change but is a little bit more prone to reliability issues and therefore takes that much more care in manufacture to make sure that it actually works right. So that's one of the issues with getting a modernized, westernized 7.62x39 gun, is dealing with the magazine issue. The other major issue is that most other Western guns that we would think of, Western platforms a little bit more accurately, that we would think of, a lot of them were originally designed for 5.56. 5.56 is kind of the standard Western fighting rifle caliber. There's others that have military usage as well, but the one that's usually considered standard infantry is 5.56, and it looks something like this. This is a steel case 5.56 round, and it is a relatively small and light projectile, and that's why a lot of Western countries really like using it. It's relatively light, it's easy for soldiers to carry. They can carry quite a bit of it without adding a whole lot of weight to the overall system, and they're usually asked to carry a bunch of other things in addition to, have a full pack on and all that. So having relatively light ammunition is definitely seen as a benefit, and the round of choice in the West is usually the 5.56 cartridge, because it is relatively lightweight. And so a lot of Western guns, Western gun platforms, have been designed around 5.56. The problem when you try to take a gun that was originally intended for 5.56 and put it in 7.62x39, in addition to the magazine issues that I've already discussed, you've also got a case head issue. So here is the 7.62x39 cartridge. Try to give you guys a good image of that. And of course the 5.56. And you can see that the 7.62x39 is a much stouter round. In terms of overall height, the 5.56 actually is a little bit longer cartridge, but the 7.62x39 is rather beefy, and it is definitely beefy in the case head. That becomes a problem when you try to modify a Western gun with Western ergonomics, because their case head is designed around the much smaller case head of the 5.56. And if I want to stick a 7.62x39 in that same spot, you're usually going to have to hog out a lot of material. So going back to our KS-47 as our example, and by the way, these guns, if I didn't already mention it, were checked and cleared off screen, so not a big deal that way. These are safe. But let's go ahead and take it apart. This would just be standard kind of field maintenance here. This isn't how to construct guns or anything like that. These are intended to do this regularly. So go ahead and take that part, set that to the side for now, and let's take a look at the bolt head. Now this is out of a gun that is designed for the 7.62x39 cartridge with its wider case head, and as you can see, the walls around the bolts are extremely thin, and that is why Palmetto State Armory, when they were making the KS-47 initially, had so many issues with it. The extractors kept breaking on it, and other companies that have tried to do the same have had issues not just with the extractors but also with the bolt itself, with these lugs actually shearing off. There's been a lot of problems with this whole thing, because that bolt was made for a much smaller diameter cartridge originally, and when you hog it out so that it will fit the larger case head of 7.62x39, you wind up making it substantially weaker, and it's a lot harder to actually get it right so that it's reliable and it doesn't break all the time. It can be done, and Palmetto has seemingly got it right on this second version of the bolt carrier group, but it's harder to do. And so when we talk about westernized 7.62x39 guns, they're almost kind of an afterthought, kind of an ad hoc thing, not particularly well done. There's some ergonomic difficulties with them, or some reliability issues with them. It's really hard to make a Western gun in 7.62x39 actually run well with good long-term reliability, sufficiently robust, etc., etc. It's a really tough thing to do. And then CZ comes along, And they decided to make a product that actually dealt with a lot of those issues from the get-go and came up with a product that was actually still fairly competitive. And their trick was basically to go back to the drawing board and avoid doing what a lot of other manufacturers did, and that is that they decided not to start with a 556 system, which is weird. Let's go ahead and bring this back into the discussion now. So here's the CZ Bren 2 again in 762x39, and it's kind of a weird genesis, because when the Brens were first coming onto the market, first being produced, of course, they were first made with the Czech military in mind, and they were made originally as 556 only guns. That was their thing. They were designed to be 556 guns. The Czech military was modernizing. They were going to go Western standard, so they wanted a 556 rifle, and they wanted a modern 556 rifle to go along with that Westernization and modernization, and they came up with what came to be called the Bren 805. And the Bren 805 was a perfectly sufficient weapon system. It did everything that the Czech military asked it to do. It was sufficient to the task, but there were some things that could be improved, and CZ decided that they would, of course, improve those things. And one of the things that they decided that they wanted to offer was a multiple caliber system. A platform that could fire more than just 556, which is what was originally made for. Excuse me. So they wanted something that wasn't going to fire just 556, but could be a competitor in markets where 762x39 was still a thing. In the Czech Republic, they had actually transitioned from 762x39 into using 556. And so CZ had experience working with countries that were in that kind of transitional space and still had a lot of 762x39 ammo running around. And so they thought it would be a good idea to make a gun that would be viable in that other caliber as well. Now, it didn't turn out to be as big of a market success as they wanted it to be, I would say. I think that we're really hoping to sell a lot of Bren 2s and 762x39 to non-Western countries, as it were, that would still have a lot of 762x39 running around and wanted to modernize their weapons but keep the same ammo. Turns out that most of the nations that wanted to modernize their weapon system also wound up wanting to modernize their ammo as well. And so CZ, even though they went through the process of making this specialized product for this market, it turns out that by and large they actually weren't able to sell, at least in terms of government contracts, many of these Bren 2s and 762x39. So that is a little bit sad, kind of a miscalculation on their part, I would say. But even though it didn't wind up being super popular, it is still a really good gun nonetheless. That's been my experience with it, at least thus far. In terms of what makes it good, is that they didn't make the mistake that a lot of Western manufacturers make when it comes to 762x39, and that is that they didn't try to convert something that was something else, basically. They didn't try to take an existing design in 556 and simply, hog out the bolt and make it so that it could take some kind of a modified magazine. No. Instead, they actually created basically a system that from the ground up would be compatible with 762x39. And so let's go ahead and start with the basis of that, which is the magazine. This is the magazine for the Bren 2, and you'll notice that the curvature along the magazine is basically the exact same curvature as you get with the AK magazines. They both are curved more or less the same amount. And it's in keeping with the taper of the 762x39 cartridge, which is what helps keeps the guns reliable. So what makes the AK magazine so great is that it's a double stack, double feed magazine with constant curvature, and CZ made their own version of that would work uniquely with their gun. It's a double stack, double feed magazine with constant curvature, but instead of it just being an AK magazine, they made it so that it would actually be compatible with Western type magwells. And so you have a little locking slot here, like you would expect to see on a Western type magazine for like an AR or something like that. So a push button release system. And so on it, you actually do have it drop free, and of course it's a standard push button just like on a standard AR. So I push the button and the magazine pops out, and it's drop free. It works perfectly like you would want a good Western magazine to work. And because it's constant curvature and it doesn't have to adjust or bend or any way, it actually works real well, and it's been perfectly reliable in my testing so far. Now, I'm not overly rich right now, and so I'm not able to put as many rounds through this as I would like to. To date, I've only been able to put 165 rounds through it, and I've made that as varied as I possibly could. So there's been some Barnaul and some good old Tula, a couple of different kinds of brass case, including Bellum and the Privy Partisan PPU stuff, as well as some of the Wolf Polyformants. I think also some of the Military Classic in there, some soft points, of course FMJs, and it's run basically everything perfectly fine. There was one type of ammunition that, and my memory's a little bit fuzzy on this because it was a little while ago that this happened, but there was one type of ammunition that it might have failed to lock the bolt back on, but I'm not overly worried about that because the Bren 2 has an adjustable gas system, and when I was testing it with the ammunition, I knew going into it that that particular ammunition was a little on the light side, and I had the gas setting in its lowest setting with the least gas coming into the gun. And if you intentionally run light ammunition on the lightest gas setting in pretty much any gun, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to fail to lock the bolt open, possibly have cycling issues, etc., etc. That's not uncommon. And not something that would be outside of the realm of expectation, so I wouldn't call that a reliability issue. CZ, the company, actually doesn't recommend that you run the gun in the lightest gas setting. They actually recommend that you run it in position 2 rather than what I have it in, which is position 1. And so that would take care of those kinds of issues. I personally just like to run, if the gas system is adjustable, I like to run my guns in the lowest gas setting possible just to reduce wear and tear on the mechanism and understand that I'm going to take a little bit of a hit in terms of reliability when I do that. But that doesn't mean that the gun's unreliable. It just means that if you run underpowered ammunition through a gun that you've intentionally undergassed, yeah, things are going to happen, but that doesn't make the system bad. But getting back to what makes it a success overall, part of it is the magazine. They took the best aspects of the typical AK magazine and converted it into something that would work with a standard magwell, which was a great thought on their part. And then they actually made sure that the gun itself was actually designed around 7.62 by 39. So let's take it apart and show you what I mean by that. Taking the gun apart for standard field maintenance, this is not, again, a gun building course or anything like that. This is just standard maintenance that you would do on practically any firearm. You would have to do a decent amount of disassembly so that you could clean it, and that's the only level of disassembly that I'm going to do here. Now, in terms of the best tool to take it apart, I personally really like using a unfired cartridge as my tool to take it apart. There's a few other things that people will do, and CZ themselves actually suggest using the corner of the magazine to push out the main pin here that's in the lower. And that works just fine, and I've done that. It's perfectly fine to use, but in this I would want to go ahead and take apart the bolt carrier group for you guys, and for the bolt carrier group need something that's a little bit pointier. So I'm going to go ahead to start with this. So go ahead and push that pin out that I indicated. And it is actually a little bit stiff, and that's intentionally done so that it doesn't come loose in the field. That would not be a good thing. So it is just a little bit stiff, and then you'll be able to see it there on the other side. There we go. Just go ahead and pull it out. There we go. And then the lower comes away from the upper, and it just fits into a slot there in the bottom. let's go ahead and talk about this lower here, because this lower is definitely unique. And I was an idiot and I forgot to make sure that the hammer was actually in the proper position. So oopsies on my part. Shouldn't really affect anything, but still, when you're disassembling a gun, it's usually a good idea to make sure that the hammer is in the locked position rather than in the forward position. And so that was a no-no on my part. I apologize. If CZ the company is watching, yes, I did a no-no, and I apologize for that. But in terms of designing the gun from the ground up to work with 7.62 x 39, this magwell is a 7.62 x 39 magwell. It's designed to take their 7.62 x 39 magazine, and it fits it flush. It is designed. This magwell is designed around this magazine, so it's not something that's been modified. Like on some of the AR systems, where it's basically an AR magazine that has 7.62 x 39 rounds stuffed in it. No, this one is designed from the ground up to be a 7.62 x 39 magwell, and it's even got a little bit of a forward flare on it so that it can accommodate that curvature that we talked about, which you usually wouldn't have with a straight push magazine. But this one is straight push, but it has a little bit of a front flare, so that you're not compromising that curvature at all. You still have a fairly deep magwell, it's still straight push, but it's flared out in the front so that you can still maintain that curvature and that reliability that comes with that curvature. So that was good on them. And then this design as a whole underwent a major generational change from the 805. Not only did they actually make the magwell itself a 7.62 x 39 magwell, but the entire lower was actually completely redesigned. And one of the redesigns is that they actually went with a different material. Originally, it was a fairly conventional gun polymer, which is basically nylon, plastic, and glass mix. And when I first got the gun in my hands, I thought that that's what this was, just a very refined polymer, conventional polymer nylon lower. Turns out I was completely wrong about that. It's actually a carbon fiber based lower, which is a really interesting thing. I've never seen that on any lower before on any of the other guns that I've owned, and it makes it very lightweight, and it's also still very strong, very rigid. It has a good feel to it. If not for the fact that, you know, its temperature conductivity is different from metal, strength-wise, this is what I would expect from a fairly conventional aluminum lower, but it's not aluminum, it's carbon fiber, basically. I think it's carbon fiber and polymer, to be technical about it, but carbon fiber based lower. But like I said, in terms of rigidity and strength, it functions just like I would expect an aluminum lower to work. It really has that feel. The only thing that gives it away is just that it's not cold to the touch like metal usually is, because metal has, of course, a higher conductivity, and so heat tends to either travel out of it more quickly or into it more quickly. And of course, something that is some kind of a composite isn't going to do that. But other than that, you know, if it wasn't for that aspect, this functions no different from an aluminum lower. So very interesting that way. In terms of cool features, but also gripes that I would have with it, this lower is designed to be fully ambidextrous, so you do have safeties on either side, and they're 45-degree throw, which is cool, and I like those. Those are good. Triggers, obviously, ambidextrous. Now, when we start getting forward of that, that's where the ambi features, to me, are not quite as good as they could be. The right-hand magazine release is pretty much in a conventional spot and what you would expect it to be, and even has these little fences above and below it that will protect it and keep it from getting accidentally bumped. But the offside one, the left-handed magazine release, is not, in my opinion, adequately protected. It's this little lever down here, so you have to kind of reach down to get to it if you're left-handed, which is a little awkward. Not the best angle, but you'll also see that there's no fencing there, and there is a divot underneath it so that it can be depressed. And in my opinion, that is not really ideal. It's a little too easy to bump this one to set it off. They really should have thought about putting some fencing on that side and also using a system that would raise it up so that it would be about the same level as the magazine release on the other side. It is ambi, which is great, but it's not symmetrically ambidextrous, and it doesn't have the fencing around the other side, which means that it is somewhat easy to bump. In terms of bolt stop bolt release, it has a ping pong paddle type that is slightly enhanced. It's a little bit larger than a typical AR's ping pong paddle, and that's not necessarily here nor there. It's fairly standard. But in addition to the ping pong paddle, they also have a little slider that's actually inside of the magwell. And so if I take my finger and push up on the slider, you can see the bolt catch coming in to place. And of course, if I push down on it, then it retracts. And that functionality is nice in that it allows someone who's left-handed to use it. But a left-handed person also, if their finger's long enough, could also come up and just simply reach the paddle release as well. I don't mind that it's there, but I don't like that it's inside of the trigger guard. CZ themselves have actually done these sliders before, but they put them just outside of the trigger guard on other models like the CZ Scorpion 3 Plus, Evo 3 Plus. The 3 Plus versions actually have sliders on them, but their slider is on the outside of the trigger guard, and so you don't actually have to put your finger inside the trigger guard to work them, and I like that a lot better. But nonetheless, it's still a very workable system, and it's still a good system in general. Also a trend that we've seen in a lot of, well, not a lot, but at least in a couple of modern firearms manufacturers, is that they're changing how they do hammer springs. So up here is the hammer, and then this green thing off to the side here, that's actually the hammer spring. Conventional hammer spring wraps around the actual hammer pin, and that is what provides the force behind the hammer. But on some more modern firearms, what we're noticing them doing is putting the hammer spring behind the hammer, and what that does is it changes where your point of maximum force is. With the conventional hammer spring that wraps around the hammer pin, when the hammer is in its fully forward position, that's actually where it's getting the weakest, where it's at its weakest, where it's actually getting the least force from the spring. It actually has more force when it's down. When they relocate the hammer like this, though, what that means is that when it's forward, you're actually getting the full extension of the spring, so it maximizes the force when the hammer is actually being deployed. And it's actually relatively easy to keep down, and what this does is it actually reduces the trigger pull considerably. On my trigger pull gauge, the 3-pull, the 3-pull average, I should say, I think was about 3 pounds. I think it was like 3 pounds 5 ounces, 3 pounds 6 ounces, a little less than 3.5. Which is a terrific pull weight for a stock trigger. Really good base up design, and like I said, this is different from the original Bren 805. And in the Bren 3s that are coming out, they're actually already in production, and they are being used by some military organizations already, some government organizations already. They just haven't been released onto the American civilian market yet. But on those, even in the Gen 3s, they actually decided to keep this lower because it is a really good lower. It's very solid. Has all the essential features that you would want in terms of ambidextrousness, and like I said, it is actually designed around 7.62x39. The magwell is a 7.62x39 magwell. For the 5.56 versions of the Bren 2 that are out there, they actually have a little insert that goes inside of the magwell to convert them down to 5.56. Ironically, in the Gen 3 version, even though they're keeping this lower, which is a 7.62x39 lower, they're actually not offering the Gen 3s in a 7.62x39. They decided that we're not really getting as many sales with the 7.62x39 as we want, and so they're going to 300 blackout instead. That's what they're trying next to get sales. But they are still using the lower just because it's a good lower. Alright, so let's put that off to the side for now. Alright, and then the next thing that we're going to take off is going to be this brace. And CZ does not make the brace. This brace is made by SB Tactical, which is a company in the US that makes a lot of the braces that show up on the US market. And for those of you who don't know what a brace is, this is a device that is basically meant to wrap around your arm. That's why it has this little bit of fabric and Velcro here on the end, so that you can one-hand something that's a little bit larger easily. You see these used with things that are considered legal pistols in America, which is basically anything that's either under 26 inches long or has less than a 16-inch barrel. And this one, the barrel on this particular Bren 2 right here is an 11-inch barrel, so it would fall under that category of being a legal pistol. And if it's a legal pistol and you want to keep it as a legal pistol rather than converting it into what is called an SBR, which is an acronym for short barrel rifle, if you want it to keep pistol status, then it needs to have a pistol brace on it rather than actually a proper stock. But the company, like I said, that makes these in the US is, well, not all of them, but a good many of them are, and be the one that would make this one is a company called SB Tactical. They make a lot of braces, and I will be the first to say that this is not one of their best models. It works, it's sufficient, but it does have a two major deficiencies. One is the little release tab inside. It's just a little tab that you pull back on, and that's what releases it from the gun so you can take it out, as I did. That little tab, though, is very, very, very thin and very flimsy. It's actually pretty easy to break. Now, of course, it is recessed, and so it's not like it's going to be easily bumped or anything like that. But if you're not aware of that going into it, it's just easy by, just kind of uncontrolled access, not being very controlled about it when you're using it as intended. It can break relatively easily, and that's not something that you really want on a gun part. A gun that's fairly reliable and has good durability, etc., etc. You want the whole gun to be made that way. And this brace, because of that little flimsy tab in there, isn't like that. Otherwise, it's fairly sufficient, but that is kind of a weak tab, and I really wish that they made that a little bit better. In addition to the tab being a problem, it actually doesn't fit in the CZ Bren 2 as it comes from the factory. When you first get the CZ Bren 2, it'll have a little plug that they put on the end, and you replace that with whatever you want to use. If you decide to go the legal route of actually converting it into an SBR, then of course you can put a proper stock on the back. You can do a brace like I did. You can just leave the plug in place if you want. But going back to my complaint about the brace isn't plug and play. You can't just take off the old plug and put on the brace. Instead, there's also a part that you have to change, and in the instructions for the brace, it didn't actually mention that you had to replace the parts. Fortunately, it did come with the part in the box, but it didn't actually say anything about installing it. And that is this little plastic plate that is on the back of the gun right now. Normally, when the CZ Bren 2 comes from the factory, it'll actually have a metal plate that is there. And that metal plate is just a little too thick down here on the bottom for the brace to fit properly. So, in order for the brace to fit properly, you have to take out the metal plate, replace it with this plastic one, which isn't very difficult, but it is kind of annoying that the instructions for the brace didn't actually say that you have to do that. It's a fairly minor complaint. It's not that hard to fix, but there was a real struggle when I first got the thing trying to put the brace in place and following the instructions saying, okay, it says you're supposed to press the little tab and push it directly into the little dovetail on the back, and I was doing all that and it was not fitting at all. I was incredibly frustrated, and then finally put together 2 and 2 that the reason why they included an alternate plate is because it doesn't fit without that alternate plate, and then it magically went together and now all was good. But it would have been nice if the instructions actually said replace the plate first, that this isn't an optional part. It should have been more obvious to me, I know, but at the moment it was very frustrating, and I'm still kind of feeling that frustration. Alright, so now we get into the main kind of guts of the gun, and first we'll go ahead and take out the recoil spring, and it is a captured recoil spring, which again you would expect from a modern gun. So it is a captive system, little plug on the back, and in terms of how it fits into the gun, this little crescent shape here goes upward when the gun is in its natural orientation. As long as you remember that that goes upward, and the rod itself goes in the bottom hole, not the little top hole, but it goes in the bottom hole, it'll be good. Not a whole lot to it there. Pretty much just a normal recoil spring. Not a big deal there. And then we can go ahead and take out the bolts, and it just slides out very nicely. And this, of course, is the complete bolt carrier group. And you will notice that the bolt on this thing is much beefier, and the width around it is also considerably thicker than in the KS-47. So here in my right hand is the KS-47's bolts. And you can see that its walls are comparatively quite thin. The face is basically the same size, but it is a fairly small bolt because it is actually a 5.56 bolt that's been modified. For the Bren 2, they started with a 7.62 by 39 bolts, and when they in the 5.56 versions, they just make this face a little bit smaller, but it's the same bolt. It's a 7.62 by 39 bolt. It doesn't have to be hogged out anymore. So it's very strong. You'll also notice that instead of being a 7-lug bolt, like you see on a lot of AR type systems, this is actually a 6-lug bolt, which is a little bit interesting. But again, bigger, beefier, not going to have the breakage problems that you get with the modern modified 5.56 guns. So that's bigger and beefier. Really nice, big, heavy, and beefy bolt. But the carrier itself is actually fairly lightweight, and you can even see that the top of it is actually basically hollow. In the full auto versions, this is of course a semi-auto version for the civilian market, because that's, well, technically civilians are allowed to own full autos, but it's not practical because of some taxation things and limited availability and a whole lot of paperwork that goes on. So what's most practical for most civilians is, of course, the semi-auto version. And in the semi-auto version, there's just this open slot in the top of the bolt carrier. But in the full auto capable versions, the select fire versions, there's actually a couple of tubes that go up here that have some dead below weights in them. And that is so that when the gun is firing full auto, you don't get what is called bolt bounce. Bolt bounce happens when the system comes forward and is operating so fast that it bounces back, and while it is bounced back with the cartridge fully seated into the bolt, the hammer gets released too quickly, and it actually sets it off even when the bolt actually isn't fully in battery. So smacks, bounce off, that's why they call it bounce. It bounces off, and the rear of the cartridge is exposed, hammer comes up too soon, sets it off, you get an out of battery detonation. That's a really bad thing. And so in the full auto versions, they actually have a couple of counterweights that sit up on top that are such that they basically act like dead blow weights, and so the bolt hits, and then the counter weights then slide into place, and they keep the bolt from bouncing. Now, in terms of them taking it off of the semi-auto versions, it does honestly make the semi-auto versions just a little bit less safe that safety feature isn't installed, because that's what it is a safety feature. But for American legal purposes and getting them guns approved for imports and that kind of thing, a lot of those kinds of features wind up getting removed from guns. Even if they don't by themselves make a gun full auto, a lot of times they get removed so that it's really clear that the manufacturer is not trying to sell the civilians a full auto gun, so they try to remove as many full auto parts as they can. And unfortunately, that also includes safety devices, like dead below counterweights that would be installed in the top of this thing that is not there now. Now, an interesting byproduct of removing the counterblow system is that it actually makes this bolt carrier group just a little bit lighter than it's supposed to be. And then And that actually resulted in problems with the first set of 7.62 by 39 Bren 2s to come into the American market. There were people that actually wound up complaining about reliability issues with them, particularly they would stovepipe a lot. And as the problem was investigated, they eventually found out that the cycling rate was a little too high. And so instead of the rounds getting kicked out like they were supposed to, they would actually get pulled back so fast that they would actually start spinning really fast in place in the ejection port. And when the BCG would come back into place, it would basically smash that casing that was spinning in place and give you the little stovepipe. So it was basically just an issue of the bolt carrier being a little bit too fast, and part of it was because they had removed part of the weight from the bolt carrier group, and so it was going too fast. The other part of it was that CZ had originally designed the gun around use with subsonic ammunition. One of their major contracts that they actually did get was with the French, the GIGN, basically their anti-terrorist unit that the French have. They did order some versions of the 7.62 by 39 guns. They ordered the 9mm version of it, and of course the select fire version, sorry, not 9mm, the 9-inch barreled versions. Mine's an 11-inch. So their versions were 9-inch barrels, and of course theirs were select fire. And they had asked for a version of it that could be suppressed and used with subsonic ammunition when suppressed. And so they had designed the gun basically around use with suppressed ammunition. And then for the supersonic ammunition, their primary ammunition that they tested it with was what they have available over in the Czech Republic, which is S&B. If you want to be fancy about pronouncing the name, because it's actually originally a French name, it'd be something like Cellier and Below. But if you read it phonetically, it's Celler and Bellet. A lot of people just call it S&B ammo. And S&B ammo is famous for being a little underpowered. They do that so that they can keep the cost low while maintaining a fairly high degree of accuracy, because that's one trick to making ammunition fairly accurate, is to decrease the powder load a little bit so you get a more consistent burn. And of course, decreasing the powder load also saves a little bit of money as well, so that's their way of making fairly accurate, fairly cheap ammo. And so S&B ammo tends to be just a little underpowered, and that's what they tested this thing with as far as supersonic ammunition was concerned. So both of the main ammo types that this thing was originally designed to run were a little bit underpowered. Then you put this thing onto the American commercial market, where our ammo tends to be a little bit hotter, and you take out part of the weight from the bolt carrier group. Yeah, this thing's going to move too fast. And that's actually why in the American version now they actually have a 3-position gas system now. So first position as you see it, which I keep it in just because I like to run my guns in the lowest gas position I can, just to save on wear and tear and those kinds of things. But that's position 1. Over to the side like that would be position 2. And then position 3 would be the most gas, most open. Originally, it only worked in the first 2 positions, and then the last position was a cutoff, if I remember correctly. It didn't have 3 positions. Now it has 3 positions so that you can keep the gun from being horribly overgassed and actually cycling correctly and cycling reliably. But yeah, the original versions were not like that. Alright, getting back to the bolt carrier group. To take down the bolt carrier group, which, by the way, the company actually does not recommend that you do very often. They say that you only need to actually take it apart once every 2,500 rounds or so. But for purposes of demonstration, we'll go ahead and take it apart. The first thing that we want to do is remove this little pin that's in the back here, and I'll just push it through on the other side with the cartridge. So there we go. So now it has popped out, and there's just a little O-ring that keeps it in place, and it functions basically the same as the cotter pin on an AR. And then once that pin is removed, then you can remove the firing pin, and there is a firing pin catch that you just need to move out of the way, and then out comes the firing pin. Fairly standard firing pin, nothing really overly special there. Then once you've removed the firing pin, then you can remove the cam pin. And again, nothing overly fancy about that, it's just a little cam pin. And then finally the bolt comes out of the carrier. And again, that is a very chunky bolt. If you want to disassemble it a little bit further, you can. There's a little pin in it that you would use to remove the extractor. I'm not going to do that in this case, but if you wanted to take it down even further, you could. But yeah, it is a very beefy bolt. Definitely a good choice to pair with the 7.62x39 cartridge. Like I said, it's basically designed around that cartridge from the ground up, and they actually modify the version from that to get the 5.56 version. And so the 5.56 version of the Bren 2 is actually incredibly strong. And that's because it was originally designed to be something else. Alright, and then to put it back in place, make sure that the extractor is on the right hand side because it's a right hand ejector. And then go ahead and line the cam pin channel up, put the cam pin back in place. Nice. And then we'll go ahead and put the firing pin through. And then we'll have to move the little lever that catches it out of the way. And that is basically the drop safety system so that the firing pin can't accidentally be hit unless it is actually being intentionally fired. So the hammer actually has to shove that little piece out of the way in order for it to work, which is good. Alright, and then make sure that the firing pin is in its most rearward position, and then I can reinsert the little retaining pin, and that just pops in place with its little O-ring, and then our bolt carrier is back together. Perfect. Alright, so that is all well and good. And then our last couple pieces of disassembly will be the charging handle and of course the gas system. The charging handle is fairly straightforward. Just move it back to its takedown slot. Has a little extra opening there that you can take it out of. And then once you get it to that slide, you just kind of have to wiggle it a little bit and it comes out. That's the charging handle, and you can of course move it to the other side if you want to. And if you wish, you can actually take the little charging handle sled out as well. So this is what normally sits above the bolt carrier group, and this is some kind of a composite piece. I'm not sure what exactly it is made of. If I had to guess, I would say the same material as the lower, so some kind of a carbon fiber composite. It's fairly light. And this is actually an interesting little bit of technology that a lot of guns don't have. And you might say, well, lots of guns have charging handle sleds that interact with the bolt, or what I should say, the bolt carrier group. That's not all that unusual. Not like this one. This one has this little catch in it that actually captures the bolt carrier group. So there's a little notch in the bolt carrier group, and the little catch actually fits right into that. So the two pieces mesh up there, and then I can, once those two pieces are meshed up, I can actually use the charging handle both to yank it forward and to push it back, which a lot of guns that have non-reciprocating charging handles don't have. With a lot of guns that have non-reciprocating charging handles, you can pull back on them just fine, but you can't actually shove the bolt forward. This one, because of that extra little piece in there, you can actually pull it forward. Well then, how does it become a non-reciprocating charging handle? Well, that's where this front catch comes into play. Once the bolt carrier group is actually fully seated, there's a little divot inside of the receiver. Actually, I should say not divot, but a protrusion that this little front catch actually hits, and it moves that catch out of the way. So there is the catch out. Then once I move that up, it removes from its slot, gets removed from its slot, and then the bolt carrier can actually move back and forth unimpeded. Weird little device that most guns with non-reciprocating charging handles don't have, but it's actually a really, really good idea, and it works quite well. And like I said, the charging handle can be moved into the other side if you want it to, but I am right-handed, so I will go ahead and leave the charging handle on the left. That would be the conventional spot for it. There we go. Move that all the way forward. Great. And then last but not least, the gas system. Gas system is super simple to take apart. Move it from whatever your position is into the final position. And then once you get into the final position, there's a little lever back here that you depressed. Turn it just a little bit more. And that will be the takedown position. Out comes the actual gas plug selector, and you can see the little holes in it that correspond to the different gas settings. And then from there, you can just go ahead and pour and dump out the rest of the bits of the gas system. So first is the actual piston piece, and then you have the transfer rod that the piston fits on top of, and the transfer rod has its own recoil spring. And so if you want to play with the sensitivity of the system, you could actually replace this spring with other aftermarket springs that are made to give it a little bit more resistance or less or whatever. So that's actually a modifiable part of the gun that can further enhance reliability or make the gun a little bit more smooth shooting, etc., etc. You can play around with it a little bit, in addition to the gas setting being somewhat adjustable. It's only 3 positions on the gas setting, but still, there's enough manipulability in the design that you can actually make it run pretty smooth. And that's pretty much all that the gas system is. You know, clean it every now and again. You usually don't have to take this part apart all that often, but you know, give it a good scrubbing once in a while and put it back in the gun, and it's basically ready to go. It's fairly maintenance free. All right, and then we just reinsert from the top here. Make sure that it fully seats. Should just barely be visible from the hole if it's in the proper perspective, if it's in the proper location, at the proper depth, I should say. And then we take the plug in, and there will be a little cutout on the bottom of the plug, and you're going to have that cutout face the barrel. And need to make sure that the piston is actually centered. There we go. Once the piston is centered, then I can put it on and then just twist it into place. And we're back to being how it needs to be. All well and good. And it's hard to see on camera, but there's actually a hole in the front of the gas plug, and what that hole is it's actually a relief hole for the gas system. So once enough gas has gotten into the system to actually make the piston move, the excess gas actually gets vented out of the front of the gun. And so the internals of the gun actually don't get all that dirty. It's not like an AR where there's usually a ton of carbon built up, or even like on AKs that still have a fair amount of carbon that get blown back into the system from the piston. Instead, this one's relatively clean. You're still going to get something in the action. That's just guns in general. But this one's actually relatively clean because a lot of the excess gets vented out the front. Kind of a cool little feature. Alright, so those are the main parts that get taken apart. Let's go ahead and put this thing back together. As with most guns, you want to make sure that the bolt is in the forward position. Make sure that it is correctly orientated. So the long part of the BCG goes to what would be the top of the gun when it's normally in terms of its natural orientation. And we just let that drop in. Now it usually doesn't go all the way forward, and that's because the charging handle sled is in the way, and the way that you get around that is you just simply reach in and push down on the charging handle sled, pull your finger out, and it will slide into place just fine. Go ahead and replace the recoil spring. Make sure that the little half moon is up and that the spring itself is in the bottom hole, not the top hole. Go ahead and put that in there. There's a little spot on the back of the bolt carrier group that it fits into, and it just kind of hangs in there loosely. And then once we have that in place, then we're going to put the brace back into this little dovetail in the back here. and it just snaps into place, no big issue. And then last but not least, the lower will go in, and it kind of rocks into place. So there's a little tab on the bottom of it that fits in to the rear. And then to make sure that that actually matches up. And and I am an idiot because I forgot to take the pin out of the way. So there's a little retaining pin. Go ahead and pop that out again. I'd closed it so that it wouldn't interfere with anything while it was laying off to the side, but if you want to reassemble the gun, yeah, that pin needs to be open. So re-put that in the slot, great, close it, make sure that it is fully seated to the rear, and then once it's fully seated to the rear, the pin should go through, perfect. Do a basic function check, clear, regular pull, drop to the sear, safety works. Okay, perfect. All right, so that's the assembly and disassembly, the basic design as to why it works and why it works so well. Has a full complement of ambi features. It's got the controls in basically all the right spots that you would want for a Western gun. Unlike an AR, it doesn't have the T charging handle. It actually has a proper side charging system that's non-reciprocating. It is indeed ambidextrous. Well, the charging handle isn't ambidextrous because there isn't a charging handle on the other side, but it can be swapped. So all the controls are either ambidextrous or swappable. It is also incredibly lightweight. Unloaded without anything extra on it, it weighs 6 pounds and 1 ounce. With a fully loaded magazine in it, it's 7 pounds 7 ounces. And then, of course, keep adding whatever other paraphernalia you want on there, whether it be a red dot, some kind of a magnified optic, etc., etc. And it does still come, it's one of the few guns on the market that actually still does come with open sights. These open sights are actually based on the Troy sights that were made in the US, but now CZ manufactures them on their own. And they're fairly conventional, more or less AR style sights with a rear diopter, and you can see a couple of luminous paint spots, and it's not permanent. It's not like it's tritium or something like that. It's just luminous paint, so you hit it with a bit of light and it glows a little bit. And then the front also has a little dot there as well, and of course fully adjustable. Could use them like pretty much any typical AR front and rear sights. They are a little heavy because they are actually solid metal, but again, it's one of the few guns that actually does come with open sights right out of the box, which is a cool feature, and I do like that. In terms of how it, another thing that is worth pointing out is that the barrel profile on these things is extremely thin. In the third generation, they're actually changing that to make the barrels considerably thicker, but in the Bren 2, they have very thin barrels on them, and they're actually perfectly fine in terms of robustness and all that. They do everything that they're specified to do, but like any thin barrel, they can be prone to a little bit of stringing if you heat them up. Semi-auto gun is not really your best bet for high precision accuracy, especially not in 7.62x39. But just so that you know, yes, if you heat up a fairly thin barrel, you're going to see diminished accuracy. That's pretty much true of any thin barrel in pretty much any caliber. And then, so be aware of that. But in the Gen 3s, they are making these a little bit thicker so that there's less heat dispersion in them, and also so that the barrels themselves are a little bit more robust. It can stand up to a little bit harder use by soldiers and that kind of thing. For those of us who are on the civilian side and collectors who wouldn't want to abuse our guns, it being a thin profile isn't a big deal. But that is a concern that is out there. It's being addressed in the third generation. I personally like the Gen 2s, one, because that's the one that was actually designed to be a 7.62x39 gun, which I love, and I would argue the most advanced, most westernized version of a 7.62x39 gun that we have available to us. Not that there aren't other westernized Western guns that have had 7.62 by 39 put in them, but this one really was designed from the ground up and has all of the right Western features with basically no compromises. I love it. And like I said, it is also lightweight. That is one of the advantages of having a fairly thin barrel, is it makes the gun just that much lighter. Lightweight, and then in terms of the shooting experience, I actually found it to be quite pleasurable to shoot in terms of the overall recoil impulse and whatnot. I've seen a lot of reviews online where they complain about how terrible this thing was and how angry the gun was. And if they were firing the first versions that didn't have that third position on the gas selector, I believe it. They probably were overgassed and felt like they're horribly overgassed. But now with that third position in the gas plug, these things are actually pretty tame and quite pleasant to shoot and very manageable. They're not quite as light as you can get with some, say, 5.56 guns, and that's just because of momentum. Recoil is more so proportional to momentum than it is muzzle energy, and while 5.56 and 7.62 by 39 can have similar muzzle energies, at least depending on which particular load you're comparing out of what barrel lengths, they're at least in the neighborhood of each other in terms of muzzle energy, but they are definitely not in the same neighborhood in terms of momentum. 5.56 has a much smaller momentum because its projectile is much smaller. And so, even if you optimize the gun as much as possible, 5.56 guns are still going to feel a little bit better in terms of recoil just because they have such a tiny projectile. 7.62 by 39, on the other hand, the projectile basically starts at 122 grains compared to the 55 grains that 5.56 usually starts at, and of course just goes up from there. So projectile is considerably heavier, and it's going to feel like that when you fire it. So yeah, it's going to be more recoil than a 5.56 gun, but with the third position in the gas block now, it really is quite manageable. Not unpleasant at all, and like I said, basically as reliable as you want it to be. I prefer to run it on the lowest gas setting just because I want lower perceived recoil, and I also want less wear and tear on the internal parts of the gun. But if you are concerned about reliability, you can of course turn the gas system up and get that added reliability that would come with that. Assuming that you're wanting to be reliable with the lighter pressure rounds. With the higher pressure rounds, it's just fine. Alright, so that is the CZ Bren 2, not in brief at all, but in fairly extensive detail, and compared with my KS47 just for comparison's sake. As I said, I think it is the most advanced 7.62 by 39 gun that's available on the US market, and I think it's going to be the most advanced one for a long time to come, because I don't see a lot of other companies actually going out of their way to design a Western gun from the ground up in 7.62 by 39. The companies that have taken Western platforms and made them into 7.62 by 39 guns have done basically what PSA did with their KS47. They took a design that was originally based on 5.56 and reworked it to fire 7.62 by 39, and that always comes with some inherent problems. Problems regarding reliability, if not reliability, then ergonomic issues with the magazine, because that probably means that they use an AK magazine, which is a rock and lock, and it's not going to drop free easily, etc., etc. If it was originally a 5.56 gun and they made it 7.62 by 39, then they probably hollowed out the bolts. If they didn't do that, then they probably redesigned the whole thing and made it fairly heavy, like CMMG did with their 7.62 by 39 guns, which are wonderfully reliable, but they're also kind of on the heavy side. Most of the Western guns that have been made to fire 7.62 by 39 just aren't quite there. They're not bad necessarily. Okay, the early versions of the PSAs weren't great, but they have had successive generations, both in terms of the receivers and in terms of the bolts, and they usually do eventually get them right, but there's a teething process and there's issues along the way, and they're still not quite perfect in the end. There still can be some ergonomic issues and other things that come up. In terms of something that really gives 7.62 by 39 its best chance of shining. Yeah, I would say that the Bren 2 and 7.62 by 39 is your best shot. If you want a truly modern 7.62 by 39 gun that's going to have all of the modern features in terms of being ambidextrous or at least swappable, that's going to have drop-free magazines, that is going to still be reasonably light, because like I said, the base weight on this thing with the 11-inch barrel is only 6 pounds 1 ounce, has a good stock trigger in it, just under 3.5 pound trigger. It's really hard for me to think of anything that would really be as good as this in 7.62 by 39, which is the reason why I wanted it. I like 7.62 by 39, and I wanted a fully modernized weapon system that really, ticked all of the boxes as to what a modern weapon system should be in 7.62 by 39. It's ergonomically superior to most other alternatives. It is reliable. It is relatively lightweight. It is a joy to shoot. I found it to be sufficiently accurate, at least within the confines of the ammunition. Most of the groups that I've been getting with this have been somewhere between 3 or 4 MOA, and with 7.62 by 39 bulk ammunition, that's pretty normal. So it's perfectly within their accuracy that I would expect. It's relatively lightweight for the size of barrel that it is. Obviously, if you add a longer barrel, it's going to get that much heavier, etc., etc. All those kinds of things, but it really is a truly modern 7.62 by 39 gun, and that's why I'm geeking out about it. That's why I'm so happy about it, and that's why I wanted to share it with you guys. If you stuck around for all of my rambling, thank you very much. For those of you who are in Christ, go with God and be blessed. For those of you who are not, I pray that you come to know Him, that you come to know the only genuine Savior of mankind. Amen.